A 32-year-old widow showed up at a cattle rancher's door with nothing but a 6-year-old daughter, worn-out boots, and a reputation no one bothered to ask about. The rancher looked her over once, the way a man appraises a horse he's already decided not to buy, and his face said everything his mouth hadn't yet. She was too heavy, too old, wrong in ways he couldn't quite name but felt completely certain about. The ranch hands heard she'd arrived and started placing bets on how many days before she quit. Nobody gave her a week. Nobody gave her a chance. What happened next, through one of the worst blizzards in Red Mesa history, would make every single one of them eat their words along with the best meal of their lives. If you've ever been underestimated, stay until the end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wagon hit a rut so hard that Elsie's head knocked against Maeve's shoulder, and the little girl woke up with a sharp inhale, grabbing her mother's coat sleeve with both hands. "Mama!" "I've got you." Maeve pulled her daughter tighter against her side and braced her free hand against the buckboard's rough planking. "Go back to sleep." "Are we there yet?" Maeve looked out across the flat, copper-colored land stretching in every direction. The sky above it was enormous, brutally enormous, the kind of sky that makes a person feel like the earth has been scraped bare and left to dry. In the far distance, maybe 2 miles ahead, she could make out a cluster of low buildings pressed against a red rock mesa like they were sheltering from something. Smoke rising thin and straight from at least 2 chimneys. "Almost," she said. Elsie twisted to look, decided the view wasn't worth staying awake for, and pressed her face back into her mother's coat. Within a minute, her breathing evened out again. Maeve did not go back to sleep. She hadn't truly slept in 4 days. The driver, a weathered freight hauler named Cobb, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, had picked her up at the junction station in Dellard's Crossing because she'd paid him 35 cents, and because the supply wagon he was already running to Red Mesa Ranch had room for one more body and a battered trunk. He hadn't asked many questions. Maeve had answered the few he did ask with as few words as possible. She'd learned years ago that the less she explained herself, the less people felt entitled to comment on her choices. "You the new cook they're bringing in?" Cobb had asked, about 6 miles back. "Housekeeper and cook," Maeve had said. The advertisement said housekeeper and cook. Cobb had made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Harrow's had 3 of those in 2 years. Last one lasted 11 days before she wired her brother in Abilene to come fetch her." Maeve hadn't responded to that. Responded to... Now, as the wagon rolled closer to the ranch yard, and she could begin to make out individual shapes, a long bunkhouse, a barn that looked solidly built, a main house with a covered porch, she felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement exactly. She'd burned through excitement somewhere back in Missouri. What she felt was more like the quiet, deliberate settling of a person who has decided, without drama, that this is going to work. It had to work. The last of the money from Thomas's railroad compensation, what little the company had offered, after fighting it for 8 months, had gone toward the train ticket east and then west, and the trunk behind her held everything that remained of the life she'd built. 2 good dresses, one for work, and one for circumstances she hoped wouldn't arise. Elsie's second pair of shoes, a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to Maeve's mother, a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. 3 books, because she refused to let Elsie grow up without stories. Thomas had been dead 14 months. She'd had 14 months to figure out what came next. And this, a rancher's advertisement in a battered newspaper, a 3-day journey on 2 different supply wagons, was what she'd arrived at. Cobb pulled the team to a stop in the middle of the ranch yard, and the sudden stillness after hours of rolling noise felt strange and complete. A dog somewhere behind the barn began barking. 2 men near the corral fence stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Maeve climbed down from the wagon before Cobb could decide whether to help her. She lifted Elsie down carefully, the girl still half asleep and clinging. Then she turned toward the main house. The door opened before she reached the porch steps. Gideon Harrow was not a man who hid his reactions well. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, rope-burned build of a man who worked his own ranch rather than just owning it, broad through the shoulders but narrow everywhere else, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete somewhere around his 30th year and hadn't shifted since. He came through the door with the specific energy of a man who'd been waiting and had prepared himself for whatever arrived. He hadn't prepared for Maeve Callister. She watched his face go through it, the quick downward assessment, the way men's eyes traveled from face to frame in one efficient motion, and then the particular stillness that followed when what they found didn't match what they'd constructed in their heads. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. He recovered, professionally. But she'd seen it. She'd been seeing that look her entire adult life. "Mrs. Callister," he said, coming down the porch steps. His voice was controlled, carefully neutral. "Gideon Harrow." "Mr. Harrow." She shook his hand. His grip was automatic, firm, the grip of a man doing something out of habit rather than intention. "This is my daughter, Elsie. She's 6. The advertisement didn't say children weren't permitted, so I brought her. If that's a problem, I'd rather know now than after I've unpacked." Something moved across his face. Not irritation exactly, but something tighter. He glanced at Elsie, who had woken fully and was staring at him with the direct, unself-conscious assessment that only small children can get away with. "You're big," Elsie told him. "Elsie." Maeve's voice was quiet, but the warning in it was clear. "She's right," Gideon said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that might have been the preliminary architecture of a smile. Then it stopped. He looked back at Maeve, and the neutral assessment returned. The advertisement said experience with large-scale cooking. "What's your background?" "Railroad camp cook for 2 years, Eastern Wyoming Territory. Before that, I ran the kitchen at the Cartwright Hotel in Dillard's Crossing for 3 years, 40 covers a night, sometimes more during the cattle shipping season. Before that, I cooked for my father's farmhands in Nebraska, which was where I learned that working men with nothing to eat become working men who don't work." She held his gaze steadily. "I can cook for 6 or 60. I can stretch a larder further than most people think possible. I know how to bake in a wood oven that doesn't run even, how to keep meat through a warm spell, and how to make a crew feel like they've eaten well even when supplies are short. That's what I know." Gideon looked at her for a moment that went on slightly too long. "The bunkhouse kitchen's been used by whoever I could get since August," he said. "It's not in good order. I'll need to see it. I'll show you around." He paused, and she could see him making some internal calculation, the kind of calculation men made when they'd already decided something but were trying to find a polite architecture for it. "Mrs. Callister, I want to be straightforward with you. The position is demanding. The outfit runs 30 men during roundup season, and the nearest town for supplies is a full day's ride. This isn't—" "Mr. Harrow." She kept her voice even and even pleasant. "I've been traveling for 4 days on 2 supply wagons with a 6-year-old and a trunk that weighs 40 pounds. I'm not fragile, I'm not confused about what I've come to do, and I don't need the work softened for me. If you want to tell me there's a reason you can't hire me, tell me plainly. If not, show me the kitchen." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Gideon Harrow looked at her, really looked, for the first time, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not warm, not welcoming, just a fractional reassessment. "This way," he said. 2 of the ranch hands were leaning against the corral fence when Maeve crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse. She heard them before she was close enough to make out words, the low, uninhibited murmur of men talking about something they thought was out of earshot. Then one of them laughed, short, sharp, and mean. She didn't look over. She kept walking, Elsie's hand in hers, following Gideon's long stride toward the building at the south end of the yard. But she heard it. She always heard it. And she filed it away in the particular mental cabinet she kept for things that would require patience rather than response. Elsie, who had the hearing of a small animal and the social calibration of someone who'd spent her life reading adult silences, looked up at her mother. "What are they laughing at?" "I couldn't say." Maeve squeezed her hand once. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Not catastrophically bad, not rotted or infested, but the kind of bad that comes from months of minimal care by people who didn't consider it their responsibility. The wood stove needed cleaning. She could see from across the room that the flue pipe had accumulated enough grease to make a winter fire genuinely dangerous. The work surfaces were crusted with old stains in colors that told a story of improvised meals, and no one bothering to scrub down properly after. Half the hanging pots had developed a skin of old grease. The flour barrel had been left open and was developing passengers. But the bones were good. That was what she saw immediately. The room was large. The stove was a proper range with 6 burners and a wide oven, not the undersized contraptions she'd made do with before. The window faced east, which meant morning light. The dry store's pantry off the back was solid and had a cool air vent built into the floor. Smart design from whoever had constructed this place. The larder, when she opened it, was reasonably stocked. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods from last season's trading, a 50-pound sack of potatoes still in decent shape. She stood in the middle of the room and made a slow circuit with her eyes. "Well," she said, "it's been—" Gideon started. "I can work with this," she said. She wasn't cutting him off exactly. She just didn't need the explanation. The kitchen was what it was. Explaining how it had gotten that way wouldn't help her get supper on the table. "What time does your crew eat?" 6 o'clock, sharp, or they'll complain. Tonight I'll need until 6:30. He looked like he wanted to argue. "The men have been working since—" "I need to clean the flue before I fire that stove," she said. "If I don't, your kitchen is a fire risk. 30 minutes gives me time to clean the flue, get the range burning even, and make something worth eating. 6:30, or they eat cold crackers. Your choice, Mr. Harrow." He was quiet for a moment. 6:30, he said. She found 2 things in the supply storage that she hadn't expected. The first was a 20-pound sack of dried apple rings pushed behind the cornmeal, probably from 2 seasons ago, still good. The second was a small crock of preserved lard sealed under cloth and wax, which told her that whoever had last managed this kitchen had, at some point, actually known what they were doing before they stopped caring. She set Elsie up in the corner with a slate and a piece of chalk she kept in her coat pocket for exactly this kind of situation. "Draw something," she said. "What?" "Anything. The mountains, the dog, Mr. Harrow's face." Elsie giggled. "He does look like something." "Draw it, don't say it." Maeve tied back her hair, found an apron hanging behind the pantry door. Someone else's. Too large even for her, which she counted as a small mercy, and started on the flue. It was dirty work. She expected that. She scraped and swept and cleaned soot from her hands and cheeks and kept moving, because stopping to think about how tired she was felt like a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Her lower back had been hurting since the second wagon, a deep ache in the muscles on the right side that flared every time she bent awkwardly. She bent anyway. The stove, once the flue was clear, drew beautifully. She built the fire slowly, feeding it with dry split wood from the pile outside the back door, letting the temperature climb evenly rather than shocking it. While the range heated, she scrubbed the work surfaces. She used lye soap she found under the sink and a brush with half its bristles worn down to nothing, which she made work, and began breaking down the supper: salt pork, sliced thin and fried down for fat, dried beans that had been soaking since she'd put them in water the moment she saw the supply. She'd started those first, before the flue, because beans took time and you couldn't rush them. Cornbread, because she could mix it in 10 minutes and it baked while everything else came together, and because nothing said we are fed to a working man like a pan of cornbread cooling on the counter. The apple rings, rehydrated in water with a measure of cinnamon and a spoonful of sugar, cooked down until they went glossy and fragrant in a cast iron pan. Gravy from the pork drippings, thickened with flour and seasoned with salt and cracked pepper, and a pinch of dried sage she found in a paper twist at the back of the spice shelf. Simple food, but simple food done right was what she did. At 6:15, the first ranch hand appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned nose and the wariness of someone who'd been told something unflattering but couldn't quite decide whether to believe it yet. He looked at the stove, at the pans, at the smell that had taken over the room. "Supper almost ready?" 15 minutes, Maeve said without turning around. "Wash your hands before you come to the table." There was a pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said, which she hadn't expected. They came in at 6:30, all of them, 12 men on the current crew. The full seasonal outfit wasn't in yet, and they filled the long table in the bunkhouse dining room with the particular restless energy of men who'd been outdoors all day and were now required to sit still. She'd heard them in the yard before supper, and she'd made out enough to understand the situation. The laughter from the corral fence, the bets she was now certain were being placed, the specific amusement of men who had already decided something and were enjoying the waiting. She set the food on the table without commentary. The cornbread was golden brown on top, tender inside, still faintly warm from the oven. The bean stew was thick and savory, the pork falling apart in it, the gravy dark and proper. The apple dessert sat in a serving bowl at the end, cinnamon sweet and fragrant. She stood back against the wall and let them eat. The silence that fell over that table was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of men suddenly required to revise their positions. Foreman Clyde Mercer, she'd placed him immediately when he walked in, because Foreman always had a particular way of entering a room that was both unhurried and very aware of being watched. Ate 2 portions of the stew before he put his spoon down. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a weathered face that had settled into permanent skepticism, and he looked at his empty bowl the way a man looks at a card he didn't expect to be dealt. He didn't say anything. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then the young cowboy from the doorway, she'd learned his name was Pete Duggan. She'd learn all of them in time. Looked up from his 3rd piece of cornbread. "This is real good," he said, in the tone of someone making a confession. "Good is the bare minimum," said the man next to him, and his name was Walt Briggs, and he was already reaching for the apple bowl. "This is better than what we had in August. August we had Hendrix. Hendrix burned water." A small ripple of laughter through the table. Not at her, a different kind of laughter. The kind that happens when a group of people has collectively agreed to relax. Maeve carried the empty cornbread pan back to the kitchen and stood at the stove with her back to the dining room, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from nerves, she told herself. From the 12 hours on the wagon and the physical work and the fact that she hadn't eaten since mid-morning. She made herself a bowl of the stew, standing at the counter, and ate it quickly and without ceremony, because Elsie would need supper too, and there were dishes to start, and she hadn't figured out where they'd be sleeping tonight, and there was a list of things that needed addressing before she could rest. Behind her, through the door, she could hear the sounds of men eating well. Spoons against bowls, the refilling of cups, the low and gradually warming conversation of a crew that had been cold and tired and was now less so. She stood there in the kitchen she'd spent 4 hours cleaning, with her back aching and her hands still trembling faintly, and she let herself feel very briefly what it meant to have pulled this off. She found Gideon Harrow on the porch after supper. He was standing with one boot up on the lower rail, looking out across the mesa in the last of the evening light. He heard her come out but didn't turn immediately, which she took as either courtesy or avoidance. She'd seen both from men like him and still hadn't always been able to tell them apart. "Mr. Harrow." She stopped a few feet behind him. He turned then, looked at her. The neutral assessment again, but there was something different underneath it tonight. Something she recognized as the particular discomfort of a man who has been wrong in a way he hasn't yet decided how to address. "The crew ate well," he said. "I noticed." He turned back to the mesa. A long pause. A coyote somewhere out in the dark gave one short, sharp cry and then went quiet. "About this morning," he started. "No need," Maeve said. "I made assumptions. Men generally do." She kept her voice even and not unkind. "I'm used to it, Mr. Harrow. I didn't come here to change your opinions. I came here to cook. Tonight I cooked. Tomorrow I'll do the same. If the work isn't satisfactory after a reasonable period, I'll expect to be told plainly, and I'll make other arrangements." He looked at her over his shoulder. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite respect. Not yet, but was something adjacent to it. "Where will you and the girls sleep?" "I was going to ask you about that. There's a room off the back of the main house kitchen. My wife used it for her sewing. It's not large." He paused. "It has a proper door. A lock on it, if you want." She looked at him for a moment. "I'd want," she said. He nodded. "I'll have someone bring your trunk over." He said nothing more, and neither did she. She went back inside, found Elsie asleep in the kitchen corner with her head on the folded apron and her chalk drawings still fresh on the slate, and she stood there looking at her daughter for a moment in the warm orange light from the stove. 6 years old and already so steady, already so accustomed to arriving somewhere new and simply accepting it. Maeve picked her up carefully, settled her against her shoulder, and carried her through the connecting door toward the main house. The room was small, a narrow iron bed, a wooden chair, a shelf with nothing on it, a window that looked out onto a side yard where firewood was stacked in neat rows against the back wall. The lock on the door was old but functional. She tested it twice before she let herself exhale. She laid Elsie on the bed and pulled a blanket over her without waking her. Then she sat down on the edge of the mattress and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and stared at the wall. Her back was bad tonight. The 12-hour wagon ride and then the hours of kitchen work had ground something down in her lower back until it felt like a heated blade laid sideways into the muscle. She shifted and the pain shifted with her. She'd had worse. She knew she'd had worse. But knowing that didn't make this feel like less. She pulled her boots off slowly, one at a time, and set them side by side at the foot of the bed. Thomas had been dead 14 months. She'd measured almost every day of those 14 months by whether she and Elsie had enough and by what the next step was going to be. There hadn't been much room for anything else. She thought about him sometimes, about his hands, which had been very gentle, and about the specific way he'd laughed at his own jokes before the punchline, which had driven her slightly crazy and which she now missed so completely she couldn't examine it too directly. But she'd made her peace with the fact that the life she'd had was finished. What mattered now was the life she was building. Red Mesa Ranch. 60-some miles from the nearest town with a real general store. 12 men and a foreman who'd already decided she'd fail, and an owner who'd looked at her at the front door and done his own arithmetic. She'd cooked one meal. That was one. She'd need 100 more before this was settled, and she knew it, and knowing it didn't frighten her. It just felt like the plain shape of the work ahead. She lay down next to Elsie without changing her clothes. She didn't have the energy, and pulled half the blanket over herself, and she was asleep inside of 3 minutes. Morning came in cold. She woke before the first light, as she always did, the internal clock that had been set by years of running kitchens that didn't start themselves. The room was gray and still. Elsie breathed deeply beside her, curled against the wall. Maeve got up, put her boots back on, ran water over her face from the washstand basin, and went to work. The main house kitchen was a different beast from the bunkhouse kitchen. Smaller, cleaner, clearly not much used in recent months. She found a coffee pot hanging on a hook and made the first fire of the morning, moving quietly because the house was still dark, and she had no idea where Gideon Harrow's bedroom was or how lightly he slept. She made coffee, standing at the window with her hands around the cup, watching the first light bleed in from the eastern edge of the mesa. The land out there was so flat and so large. She'd grown up in Nebraska, so she wasn't unfamiliar with flat and large, but there was something about this particular landscape that was even more stripped down. The red rock, the thin, dry grass, the sky that started looking like a sky at the horizon and then became something else entirely overhead. She heard boots on the floor behind her and turned. Gideon Harrow stood in the doorway in his work clothes, already dressed, up before her, which surprised her, looking at the coffee pot with the expression of a man who has accepted that he will be surprised by things and has decided to take it in stride. "I didn't know you'd be," he started. "I'm up early," she said. "There's coffee. Cups are on the shelf." He came into the kitchen. She moved slightly to give him access to the shelf, and he took a cup down and filled it and stood at the other end of the counter. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He drank half the cup before he spoke. "Mercer wants to know about the bunkhouse coffee situation," he said. "Usually they make their own, but it's—" "I'll handle the bunkhouse coffee," she said. "I'll be over there by 5:45. Breakfast at 6:15. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You don't sleep late." "I never did." She refilled her own cup. "The coffee barrel in the bunkhouse is running low. If there's an order going to Dellard's, I'll need to add to it. I'll make you a full list of what needs replenishing. Supply wagon comes Fridays. Today is Tuesday." She did the math in her head. "I can make do for 3 days. After that, depending on what the crew looks like going into the week, I may need to improvise." He was looking at her in a way she couldn't quite read. Not the disappointed assessment from yesterday. Something more complicated and less settled. "You always talk this much before the sun comes up?" he asked. She looked at him. "I talk about what needs talking about," she said. "When there's nothing useful to say, I don't say it. You'll find I'm fairly practical in that regard." Something moved in his face. She still couldn't quite name it, but he turned back to his coffee, and she turned back to the window, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, which was, she supposed, a beginning. The trouble started 4 days later. She'd known it was coming, the way it always came, not as a single confrontation, but as the slow accumulation of small hostilities, the kind of friction that men applied when they wanted something to fail without quite being willing to say so directly. Clyde Mercer was the orchestrator, though she didn't think he fully understood that about himself. He was at the bunkhouse table that Thursday morning when she arrived, earlier than the others, sitting with his coffee mug and a piece of hardtack he'd apparently decided to eat rather than whatever she was making. He watched her come in and begin the fire and lay out the breakfast preparation with the particular watchfulness of a man who is waiting for evidence. "You know," he said, after about 10 minutes of silence, "come round-up time, the kitchen runs all hours. Sun up to near midnight. You'll have the full outfit. 30 men, sometimes more. That's a different proposition than feeding 12. "I know what roundup is," Maeve said. "I'm just saying." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "We had a cook 2 summers back, big fella. Came with good references from a cattle outfit in Texas. Quit on the 4th day of roundup. Just walked off." "What happened to him?" Mercer shrugged. "Couldn't take the pace. It's not a gentle job." "I'm not a gentle person," Maeve said. She cracked 4 eggs into a pan without looking at him. "I appreciate the information, Mr. Mercer. I'll keep it in mind." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I looked at the flour barrel yesterday. I ordered more on the supply list. You're going through it fast. 12 men, 3 meals a day." She kept her back to him and her voice level. "Yes, I'm going through it. That's how food works." She heard him shift in his chair, the small, deliberate exhale of a man who wants to escalate but can't quite find the right foothold. "Harrow's going to have to decide," Mercer said, more to himself than to her, "whether this arrangement makes sense long term." She turned around. She looked at him steadily, the spatula still in her hand, and she let the look last long enough to be unambiguous. "When Mr. Harrow decides that," she said, "I expect he'll tell me. In the meantime, the eggs are going to burn, so if there's nothing else—" Mercer stood, took his coffee mug, and walked out the back door. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were perfectly still. She heard the actual thing that night, the thing people had been dancing around, from outside the bunkhouse window. She hadn't been eavesdropping. She'd come to check that the back door was latched, which it wasn't always, and she'd stopped when she heard her name. 2 voices. Mercer and a senior hand named Dale Ridgway, who had the look of a man who'd been doing this work his whole life and had decided somewhere along the way that he'd seen everything. "Can't last," Ridgway was saying. "Woman like that out here, come roundup, it'll be—" "It's not about roundup," Mercer said. "It's about what Harrow's thinking with, bringing in someone who can't—" He paused, seeming to search for the word that meant what he wanted it to mean without quite saying it outright. "She's not fit for it." "She cooks fine," Ridgway said, which surprised her. "Cooking fine isn't the problem. The problem is that there's 20 miles of rough country between us and help, come the bad weather, and what we don't need is—" "You're saying she's too heavy to pull her weight out here?" Silence. "I'm saying," Mercer said, "that Harrow got what he paid for on looks, and then some, and got nothing like what he was expecting in terms of—" Maeve walked away from the window. She walked back across the yard to the main house, through the kitchen to the small room where Elsie was sleeping, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and looked at her hands. She'd heard versions of this her entire adult life, the specific arithmetic that men did when they looked at her, calculating her worth by her dimensions as though a body's shape was a reliable index of everything inside it. She'd been hearing it so long that it had lost its power to hurt in the sharp, immediate way it once had. What it did instead was settle into a low, familiar weight. Not grief exactly, but something that had the same gravity. She breathed. She thought about Thomas, who had never once looked at her that way, who had seen something else from the first time he'd met her, and had stuck with what he saw for 6 years. She thought about Elsie asleep behind her, who was going to need to see her mother do more than survive this. She thought about the kitchen that she'd spent 2 days making functional, and which was, whatever anyone thought of its cook, running well. Then she lay down, and she went to sleep. She had an early morning. She always had an early morning. The 11th day brought the first frost. Maeve woke to it, the particular quality of cold air through the window gap that means the overnight temperature dropped further than expected. She dressed quickly, layering, and went to the bunkhouse kitchen and built the fire faster than usual. She was making oatmeal with dried fruit and a thick molasses and butter topping when Gideon came through the back door, which he'd started doing in the mornings. She hadn't commented on it, and he hadn't explained it, and they'd arrived at a sort of functional truce over the morning coffee that she'd come to regard as one of the more reliable parts of her day. "There'll be a freeze by end of week," he said, pouring his coffee. "I know, I smelled it yesterday." He glanced at her. "You can smell weather? You can't?" He sat down, which he didn't usually do in the bunkhouse kitchen. She noticed it, but kept working. "The supply wagon's coming tomorrow," he said. "Full order?" "The list is on the shelf. I added to it twice." "Mercer said you're going through supplies quickly." She set down the spoon she was stirring with, turned fully to face him, and looked at him with the direct, even expression that she'd been told, more than once in her life, made men feel like they were being graded. "I'm feeding 12 men 3 times a day and producing food that your crew is finishing down to the pan," she said. "If that's using too much supply, I can cook less. But then your men will notice, and they'll complain, and you'll hear about it from Mercer, who is already watching for reasons to recommend I leave. So I'll let you determine which cost is higher, flour and cornmeal or crew morale." Gideon stared at her. "Mercer said you're going through flour," he said again, more slowly. "He did say that," Maeve said. "He says a lot of things. Most of them are about whether I'm going to last. For what it's worth, I intend to." A very long silence. Gideon looked down at his coffee. "I'll approve the full order," he said. "Thank you." He drank his coffee. She went back to the oatmeal. After a minute, he said, "It's good coffee. This whole time it's been good coffee." She didn't turn around. "I know." But she was very slightly smiling at the stove. Brabant. She had been at Red Mesa Ranch for 16 days when she understood that the ground was shifting. It was small things. Pete Dugan had started asking occasionally if she needed water brought in from the pump. Not because anyone told him to, but because she'd noticed him carrying it once without being asked, and now it happened most mornings. Old Walt Briggs had left a bundle of dried herbs on the kitchen counter, sage and something she thought might be wild thyme, with no explanation and no acknowledgement when she thanked him, which was its own form of communication. 2 of the younger hands had taken to fighting over who got the dish duty after supper, not because it was pleasant work, but because the competition itself had become a kind of joke they all shared. She wasn't winning them over. Not exactly. What was happening was subtler. They were simply adjusting. The way water adjusts around a rock, eventually, without the rock having to do anything other than remain where it is. Clyde Mercer remained unmoved. He was polite, in the surface sense. He ate what she made. He didn't repeat his comments from outside the window, not within her hearing. But there was something in the way he watched her, the way his eyes followed her movements when she was working, that felt like a man waiting for a clock to run down. She understood what he was really waiting for. Not an error, not exactly. He was waiting for the physical evidence of something he already believed. For her body, sooner or later, to confirm his math. She worked harder on the days she felt him watching. She also started doing small things that had nothing to do with cooking. She'd found, in the supply shed, a box of vegetable seeds, turnips, carrots, winter squash, that someone had ordered and never planted. There was a patch of ground on the south side of the main house that caught good sun and was sheltered from the northwest wind by the house wall itself. She began turning the soil during the hour between lunch cleanup and afternoon prep, working it with a borrowed spade until her shoulders burned, adding kitchen compost to break up the red clay. It was too late in the season for most of it, but winter squash might still come in, and the turning of the soil would make the ground ready for spring planting, which meant spring planting would actually happen. She wasn't thinking that far ahead. Or she was, but she wasn't examining it directly. She was just working the ground. That was the thing about this place. She was beginning to understand. Red Mesa Ranch wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. It wasn't soft or green or forgiving. But it was honest. The land said plainly what it was and what it required. There was nothing deceptive about it. The hardship was the hardship, and the rewards, when they came, were exactly as earned as they felt. She could work with that. She was still working the garden patch late on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard boots on the ground behind her and looked up to find Gideon standing at the corner of the house. He looked at the turned soil, then at her, then at the seed packet she'd left on the nearby fence post. "Winter squash," she said, standing and pressing the knuckles of her gardening hand against the ache in her lower back. "Might be too late in the season, but the ground needs working anyway." He picked up the seed packet and looked at it. "My wife used to grow these," he said. Not to her exactly, more to the packet. She waited. "She had a better spot for it," he said. "Out behind the barn. More water there, runoff from the roof." Maeve looked in the direction he indicated. "Show me?" He looked at her for a moment, that particular expression she still hadn't entirely decoded, and then he said, "Come on," and walked toward the barn. She followed him. The spot behind the barn was, as he'd said, better. The soil was darker, richer. She knelt and took a handful and felt it crumble properly in her palm, the way good garden soil does. "I'll move the plants here," she said. He nodded. They stood there for a moment in the late afternoon quiet, the warm smell of hay from the open barn and the sharp smell of turned earth and the sky going orange above the mesa. "She planted sunflowers along the fence," he said, still looking at the ground. "Every spring. Said it gave the horses something to look at." Maeve didn't say anything. She just listened. "Died 3 winters ago," he said. "Before Christmas." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it without performance. "Ranch got very quiet," he said. He turned and walked back toward the main house without further comment, and she stayed where she was for a moment, looking at the dark soil in her palm, then set it down gently and followed the path back to the kitchen. She had supper to start. She always had supper to start. But she was thinking about sunflowers. The frost that Maeve had smelled coming arrived on a Thursday and stayed. It wasn't a killing frost, not yet, but it was the kind that left the ground iron hard by morning and made the horses stamp and blow in the corral and made the men at the breakfast table eat faster and drink their coffee in larger gulps than usual. She could feel the season changing the way the ranch itself could feel it, in the tightened quality of everything, the way sounds carried differently across the hard ground, the way the sky had shifted from its summer blue to something paler and more serious. She put extra cornbread on the table that morning without being asked. The men ate it without commenting, which was the highest compliment the bunkhouse offered. Mercer watched her carry the second pan out from the kitchen, and she saw him watching, and neither of them said anything. That had become the texture of their relationship, a kind of armed truce that held as long as neither of them pressed on it directly. She understood he was still waiting. She understood he'd made a determination about her that had nothing to do with her cooking, and that no number of good meals was going to fully dissolve it. Some opinions weren't made from evidence and couldn't be unmade by it either. She worked around that the way she worked around the stove that ran hot on the left side, carefully, and with full knowledge of where the danger was. The days settled into a rhythm she could feel in her body by the end of the 3rd week. Up before light, fire built in the bunkhouse kitchen, coffee on before 5:45, breakfast at 6:15, oatmeal or eggs or both, biscuits if she'd had time to mix them the night before, always salt pork or bacon, always hot coffee in quantity because cold men doing hard physical labor needed the heat of it as much as the caffeine. Midday, she packed a field meal for whoever was working the far pasture, wrapped biscuit sandwiches, hard cheese, dried fruit, a jug of coffee kept hot by wrapping, and left it with whoever was running supplies out. Supper at 6:30, always hot, always substantial. In between, she cleaned, planned, inventoried, repaired what she could repair in the kitchen itself. She'd found that the bunkhouse oven ran 4 degrees hotter than the dial suggested, which explained the burnt bottoms on the first week's cornbread. She'd shimmed the left leg of the prep table so it didn't rock. She'd organized the dry stores by frequency of use because the previous system, which appeared to be no system at all, wasted 5 minutes every morning just locating things. Small improvements, the kind that compounded invisibly. Elsie had attached herself to the ranch the way 6-year-olds attach to things, completely and without reservation. Within 2 weeks, she knew every horse by name and had strong opinions about all of them. She'd decided that Pete Duggan was her favorite of the hands, which Pete bore with the slightly panicked good nature of a young man who had never been anyone's favorite before and wasn't sure what it required of him. She'd also, somehow, found her way into a conversation with old Walt Briggs about the proper names of clouds, which had resulted in the two of them spending a whole afternoon pointing at the sky and arguing, in the most companionable way imaginable, about whether the formation over the mesa was a cumulonimbus or just a large cumulus having a bad day. Maeve watched this from the kitchen window sometimes and felt something complicated, gratitude mostly, and under it a sharp, protective fear that she pressed down and refused to examine too directly. This was not a permanent situation. She had no guarantees. The arrangement could end, and if it ended, she needed Elsie to be able to pack up and move without too much damage. But watching her daughter argue about clouds with a 50-year-old cowboy who was smiling more than he'd probably smiled in years, it was difficult to maintain the emotional distance that prudence required. She was still working on that. It was the 22nd day when Gideon came to find her in the garden. She was on her knees in the dirt behind the barn, in the better spot he'd shown her, pressing seeds into the dark soil with her thumb and trying not to think too hard about whether the temperature would hold. He came around the corner of the barn with his hat in his hand and a piece of paper folded in his palm, and he had the look of a man who had been working up to something. "Sit down," she said, without looking up. "Or don't, but you're making me nervous hovering." He sat on the fence rail. "I heard from the professional cook," he said. She pressed another seed in. "The one you'd hired for the season?" "He's not coming." He unfolded the paper. A telegram, she could see. "Got hired on by a cattle baron outfit in New Mexico at twice the rate. Sent his apologies by wire." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "When was this?" "Yesterday. He paused in the way of a man who is editing what he was about to say. "I should have told you immediately." She studied him for a moment. "You were deciding something." "I was thinking," he said, which was probably as close to an admission as he was going to offer. "I'm the cook," she said. "I have been for 22 days. Whether you hired someone else for the position that doesn't change what I'm doing. It means you'll be here through Roundup. Was I not going to be?" He looked at the telegram in his hands, then folded it again. "I hadn't fully decided." She felt something cold that had nothing to do with the November air, and she kept her face still and her voice even. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I'm telling you you're staying," he said, which came out sharper than he'd intended, and he seemed to hear that. His jaw tightened. "I mean, I want you to stay. Through Roundup and after. I should have said that directly 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. He looked back with the particular discomfort of a man who was not accustomed to apologizing and was attempting something adjacent to it without quite using the word. "All right," she said. All right, I'll stay." She turned back to the garden. "The squash seeds are in. We'll see if the ground holds warm enough." He sat on the fence for another minute, not saying anything. "I could help with he started. "Go do your work, Mr. Harrow," she said. "I'll have supper on at 6:30. She didn't look up, but she heard something in his exhale that sounded almost like relief, and she heard him stand and walk back toward the barn. And she pushed another seed into the dark soil and thought about the fact that he had almost sent her away without telling her, and that the thought of that, of packing Elsie into a wagon again and rolling back toward nowhere in particular, sat in her chest like a stone she hadn't known was there until someone had shifted it. She pressed the soil flat with her palm and moved on to the next row. The blizzard came in the 3rd week of November. She'd smelled it 2 days before it arrived. A quality to the air, a particular damp cold that was different from the dry freeze they'd been having, coming in from the northwest in a way that meant the mountains had already caught whatever was building. She'd mentioned it at the breakfast table on the Monday, not to the room in general, but to Gideon, who was eating standing up at the counter because the table was full and he hadn't wanted to displace one of his men. "Something's coming," she said quietly, passing him a refilled coffee cup. He'd looked at her. "How soon?" 2 days, maybe 3. I could be wrong." He'd looked out the window at the flat, pale sky. "You're probably not wrong. The larder's in good shape. I stocked it heavier last Friday because I thought we might get weather before the next supply run. If you need me to pull anything from the cold storage and bring it into the dry pantry before it freezes out there, tell me today." He'd set his cup down and gone to find Mercer within the hour. What followed was the controlled but urgent activity of a ranch that knew what a bad northern blizzard could mean. The batten down of hatches that was the frontier equivalent of battening down hatches. Livestock moved, water supplies secured, firewood stacked inside the covered shed rather than outside it, the vulnerable tools and equipment brought into the barn. Maeve spent the afternoon she'd allocated to garden work instead, hauling provisions from the cold storage into the dry pantry, reorganizing the larder to maximize what she had, and understand exactly where the limits were. 31 pounds of dried beans, 60 pounds of flour, plus 14 she'd held back from last week's delivery, specifically against weather. Salt pork, a good quantity. Canned goods, tomatoes, peaches, corn, a 50-pound sack of oats, dried fruit in a sealed tin, coffee for 2 weeks at minimum, lard and rendered fat in several crocks, sugar, salt, baking powder, cornmeal. She took a sheet of paper from the shelf and made a proper inventory, something she'd been meaning to do since week 1. Column 1, what she had. Column 2, estimated days at current consumption. Column 3, adjustments if the crew expanded. That last column was the one she stopped at. The full roundup outfit hadn't arrived yet. The main crew, 12 men plus Mercer, was what she'd been cooking for, but she knew from Gideon's descriptions that the seasonal hands came in waves as the drive moved north, and that at peak roundup Red Mesa Ranch might be feeding 25 to 30 men at once. If the blizzard trapped a drive crew out in it, they'd be pushing toward the nearest shelter. And the nearest shelter, for anything moving through the Red Mesa corridor, was this ranch. She did the math twice. Then she made a second list, a prioritized supply run list in case the weather broke before the next scheduled delivery, and put both sheets on the shelf above the stove where Gideon would see them when he came in for his morning coffee. The blizzard hit on Wednesday before dawn. She knew it had arrived before she opened her eyes because the quality of sound outside the window had changed completely. The particular muffled roar of heavy snowfall driven sideways by wind, the way it made the wooden walls of the house creak and pop with the cold pushing against them. She dressed faster than usual, layering everything she had, and went to the bunkhouse kitchen through the covered walkway that connected it to the main house. A walkway she'd blessed more than once already in the frost mornings and was now prepared to consider one of the finest architectural decisions in the history of Red Mesa Ranch. The kitchen was cold. She'd banked the stove the night before, but the overnight temperature had dropped hard, and the banked coals had given up most of their warmth. She rebuilt the fire with hands that ached in the cold, working carefully, coaxing the flame. Through the small window above the sink, she could see nothing but white and darkness, the two pressed together in a moving wall. She had the coffee on, and breakfast started when Gideon came through the door at 5:50, already in his heaviest coat with snow on his shoulders. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough." He poured coffee immediately and drank it standing by the stove. Winds out of the northwest, hard. Temperature dropped another 10 degrees overnight. The cattle in the south pasture were moved yesterday. They're in the winter paddock. The men are here. The drive crew? He was quiet for a moment. "There's a crew of 16 out on the north range," he said. "Started a drive 3 days ago. They should have pushed back toward the ranch when the weather turned, but they might not have turned in time." Might not have. She looked at the larder, not because she needed to look at it, but because she was running numbers again. 16 additional men. The full house crew, 12 plus Mercer. Gideon himself. Elsie. 29, 30 people, possibly more, for however long this storm held. "Do you know how long it might last?" 2 days, maybe 3. Could be worse. She turned back to the stove. "I'll need to adjust the meals. More volume, less variety. I'll run the stew base and keep it going. Add to it as needed. Stretch it with whatever makes sense. Bread twice a day instead of once. Coffee, continuous." She was already calculating in her head the way she'd been calculating her whole working life. "The oat supply is the weak point. I can make it last 4 days if I cook oatmeal for breakfast instead of anything more complicated. But if the storm holds past that, it won't," he said. "You hope." He looked at her. A half second of something that was almost wry. "I hope," he agreed. "Then I'll plan for 4 days and pray you're right about the 5th. She caught herself. "I'll plan for 4 days and trust the forecast." She started the day's bread before the sun came up, not because she'd need it until supper, but because bread needed time, and time was the one thing she could invest now that couldn't be rushed later. She mixed 2 batches of dough and set them to rise near the stove, covered with the cleanest cloth she could find, and went to work on the breakfast for the house crew, while the wind pressed itself against the walls and the temperature outside continued to fall. The 12 men came to breakfast quiet and thoughtful, the way men got when the weather was serious and they knew it. They ate without the usual morning arguments and jokes, and they drank more coffee than normal, and most of them lingered at the table longer than they needed to, not because the food was particularly special. It was oatmeal and biscuits and more salt pork, but because the kitchen was warm and outside was not. Mercer ate his breakfast standing at the far end of the table and said nothing. She kept working. The North Drive crew came in at 2 in the afternoon. She heard them before she saw them. The sounds of horses in the yard, boots on the porch, voices pitched high with cold and relief, and the specific kind of loud that men get when they've been silent and frightened for too long. Then the door opened and the cold blew in, and 16 men came through it in a ragged wave, shedding snow and ice, and the particular smell of men who had been outside in serious cold for too long. She already had the pot on, not the stew. The stew was for later. Right now it was coffee, which she'd been keeping hot and strong since morning, and she'd made the calculation about timing 45 minutes earlier, when she'd heard the first horse in the distance and understood what it meant. The first man through the door was a barrel-chested trail boss named Heck Donahue, whom she'd never met, who stopped 2 steps into the kitchen and stared at her with the particular disorientation of a man who has been outside in a blizzard for 12 hours and is now standing in a warm room in front of a stove. "Who are you?" he said. "The cook," Maeve said, handing him a mug of coffee. "Sit down. There's more behind you." He sat down. The other 15 men filled the kitchen and the adjoining dining room in a slow flood, shaking snow from their coats, pulling off ice-stiffened gloves, making the kinds of sounds that bodies made when they stopped bracing against cold and were allowed to simply exist in warmth. 2 of them looked bad. Not frostbitten, she assessed quickly, but close to exhaustion, the kind of cold tired that went deeper than the skin. She put the stew on the direct heat, turned it up, and began the bread. "How long since you ate?" she asked Donahue. "Breakfast," he said, wrapping both hands around the mug. "Long one." "I'll have stew in an hour. Bread by late afternoon." She looked around the room, men in various stages of thawing, some at the table, some still standing, the room considerably louder than it had been 2 hours ago. "Any injuries?" "Cutter's got his hands bad," one of the younger men said. "Too long on the reins in the cold. Send him to the kitchen first. I've got lard wraps for that." She kept moving. She did not stop moving for the next 6 hours. The stew came up in batches. She couldn't do all of it at once, not in the one large pot the kitchen had, so she staged it, kept the first batch hot while the second came up, moved them between direct heat and the warming shelf in a cycle that kept everything at the right temperature without burning. The bread came out of the oven in 2 big pans, and she had it sliced and on the table before it had fully cooled, because hot bread was hot bread, and waiting for perfect timing was a luxury she didn't have. Somewhere in the middle of this, her lower back informed her that it had reached the end of its professional patience. She stood at the stove and pressed her fist into the right side of her back and breathed through the sharp flare of pain, and then she shifted her weight to the other foot and kept going, because there were 29 people in this building in the middle of a blizzard, and the only person running this kitchen was her. She moved the pot. She sliced the bread. She called out to Pete Duggan, who was hovering near the kitchen door with the look of someone who wanted to help and didn't know how, and she put him to work filling coffee cups, because that was something he could do without instruction and would free her hands for the things he couldn't. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and he said it with the specific seriousness of a young man who has realized the situation is real. Mercer came into the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. She was ladling stew into a large serving bowl, her arms aching with the repetitive work, the steam rising up around her face. "You need help?" he said. She turned briefly. He was standing in the doorway with his arms slightly away from his sides, the body language of a man not sure what posture to take, and his face had lost its usual watchful quality. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, uncertain. "There's a potato sack in the cold pantry," she said. 20 pounds. I need it in here. And then the flour barrel needs moving. I'll need to access the bottom of it tonight. He went and got the potatoes without another word. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls, and the wind screamed in the stovepipe, and the temperature dropped further into the dark hours of the afternoon. And inside the bunkhouse kitchen of Red Mesa Ranch, Maeve Callister worked the stove. She made more stew. She made more bread. She kept the coffee coming. When two of Donahue's young hands fell asleep sitting up at the table, she covered them with spare blankets that she sent Pete to find in the bunkhouse storage, because they were too tired to make it to the beds, and she wasn't about to wake exhausted men just to relocate them 4 feet. She found Elsie at 6 o'clock, curled in the kitchen corner on the folded apron again. Her daughter had an instinct for the warmest spot in any room. Reading one of the 3 books by the light of the lamp Maeve had hung on the hook above the corner shelf, specifically so Elsie would have light for reading when the evenings got short. "Are you hungry?" Maeve asked. "Walt gave me some bread," Elsie said, not looking up. "And stew. It was good." "Did you thank him?" "I said thank you twice." She turned a page. "The second time he said I was going to end up reading every book on the frontier if I wasn't careful. I said that was the plan." Maeve looked at her daughter for a moment, this small, steady, entirely uncomplicated person, and felt the exhaustion in her bones soften very slightly into something warmer. "1 more hour," she said. "Then bed, regardless of what's happening." "Is the storm worse?" "It's holding." Elsie looked up from the book. "Will the men be all right?" "They're inside and they're fed. That's all right enough." The girl looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment that children made when they were deciding whether the adult answer was the real answer. Apparently she decided it was, because she went back to the book. Maeve went back to the stove. By 9 o'clock, the ranch was as settled as a ranch with 30 people in it could be during a blizzard. The drive crew had eaten, and most of them were down in the bunkhouse or the barn loft, which had been converted to sleeping space with blankets and hay. The house crew was quieter, some of them playing cards at the far end of the dining table, the youngest ones already asleep. Gideon had been in and out 3 times, checking the animals, checking the building, doing the things a ranch owner did in serious weather. And each time he came in, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stood near the stove for a few minutes without conversation, which she'd come to understand was his way of taking in the situation, including the fact that the kitchen was still running and the food was still being produced. On his 3rd pass through, near 9:30, he stopped. He looked at the kitchen, at the stove, the bread cooling on the shelf, the stew pot on the low heat, Elsie asleep now in the corner. And then he looked at Maeve, who was wiping down the prep surface with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who had run out of actual energy an hour ago and was running on something else now. She looked back. "How are you?" he asked, and the question was different from his usual mode of speaking, simpler and more direct. She set the cloth down. "I'll answer that tomorrow," she said, "when I know the answer." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you need—" he started. "I need to not talk right now," she said. "I need to clean this surface, make sure the stove is banked right for overnight, and then I need to sleep. In that order." He nodded. He refilled his coffee without being asked, and went back out into the cold to check on his horses. And she stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the clean surface and breathed. The wind outside pressed against the walls like something alive and insistent. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. The room smelled of bread and stew and coffee and something that was almost the smell of a home that was actually inhabited. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went to bank the fire. She had a lot of men to feed in the morning. The blizzard held through Thursday and into Friday. By the second morning, the ranch had settled into a strange, compressed kind of living. All those men in 2 small spaces. The particular social pressure of people who hadn't chosen each other's company now required to share it indefinitely. The card games at the dining table had grown longer and more serious. Arguments broke out over small things. The order of the coffee line, who had taken whose spot near the stove. The way arguments always broke out when men were cold and confined and had no work to put their hands to. Maeve cooked through all of it. She'd developed a system by the second day because systems were what made impossible things possible. The oatmeal went out in 2 large pots at 6 in the morning, supplemented by whatever bread remained from the night before, toasted on the stovetop in batches until it was warm and had some crispness back. Midday was a soup, thinner than the stew, but with dried beans and salt pork and whatever root vegetables she could reach, without going into the full cold of the outside larder, which she avoided unless necessary because the temperature out there had dropped past the point where even a quick trip left her hands clumsy and slow. Supper was the stew proper, rebuilt each afternoon from the base she kept going on the back burner, thickened and seasoned and stretched with cornmeal dumplings when the volume needed expanding. It wasn't luxurious food. She wasn't trying to make it luxurious. She was trying to keep 29 people fed and warm and physically capable of getting through the next 24 hours. And she was doing that, and she kept the standard of that very clear in her mind because when exhaustion started to erode the edges of her attention, she needed something simple and non-negotiable to return to. Feed the men, keep the fire, do it again. Her back had moved past the acute phase of pain and into a kind of chronic background complaint that she had learned over years to work around rather than through. She shifted how she stood at the stove, more weight on the left, and she took the occasional 30 seconds to press both fists into the base of her spine when the bunkhouse dining room was loud enough that no one would notice. She drank water even when she didn't feel thirsty, because dehydration made everything worse, and there was no one here to remind her. On the second night, Pete Dugan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9 o'clock with a look on his face that said he had something to say and wasn't sure of his welcome. "There's a poker game," he said, "in the dining room. Walt says you should come when you have a minute." She was cleaning the stew pot. "Tell Walt I'll come when the kitchen's done." Pete hovered. "That might be a while," she said. "I know. I can help with—" He looked at the pot in her hands with the expression of a young man assessing a task he has never done and is not certain he can do. "What do you need washed?" She looked at him for a moment, then she handed him the pot and pointed at the water bucket and the scrub brush. "Scour it," she said. "Don't just wipe, actually scrub. And when it's done, rinse it twice." "Yes, ma'am." She went and sat in a chair near the dining room door for 11 minutes, while Pete Dugan scrubbed the stew pot with the focused determination of a person attempting to prove something. She didn't play cards. She didn't have the energy for cards. But she sat in the warmth and listened to the sounds of men arguing about whether a flush beat a full house. It did not. Walt informed the table with the authority of someone who has been corrected on this point and done the research. And she let her spine have 11 minutes of not being vertical and bearing weight. When Pete called out that he was done, she went back in and checked the pot, found it good, and sent him back to the card game. It was the most rest she got in 2 days. The storm broke on Saturday morning. She knew it before she looked out the window, from the same quality of silence that had preceded Thursday morning's arrival. The absence of the wind pressing against the walls, the way the building seemed to exhale slightly when the pressure dropped. She built the morning fire and went to the window and looked out at a world that was white and still and blindingly clear, the sky above the mesa a hard, luminous blue that looked polished. Everything hurt. She stood at the window with her coffee and took a personal inventory. Both hands were red and dry from the cold water and the constant washing. Her lower back had made peace with nothing and would require convincing before she could bend properly. Her left shoulder had developed a complaint she didn't remember starting. She was tired in the bone-level way that sleep could address, but that a single night wouldn't clear. She made breakfast anyway. The men came to the table that morning with the particular mood that follows the end of something hard. Louder than usual, sharper in their jokes, the collective relief coming out sideways in the way it always did. Heck Donahue's drive crew began talking about when they could move again, assessing the snow depth in the yard with the professional eyes of men who had ridden in winter conditions before and knew what was workable. It was in the middle of this breakfast, the room at full occupancy, all 29 men at the tables, the noise level at its highest point in 2 days, that Silas Boone said what he said. She'd noticed him the first morning the drive crew arrived. He was the oldest man in Donahue's outfit by a considerable margin, somewhere north of 65, with the kind of face that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the mesa, weathered past expression and into something more permanent. He moved slowly and deliberately and ate that way too, and he hadn't said much in 2 days beyond what the situation required. She'd noticed him because quiet men in loud rooms were either completely uninvested or very attentive, and this one had the eyes of the second kind. He'd watched her work the kitchen from his seat at the far end of the table. Not in the way she'd been watched before, sorry. Not Mercer's waiting for failure surveillance, not the dismissive appraisal from the corral fence, just watching, processing. On Saturday morning, he was in his usual spot at the end of the table, and the conversation around him had turned to what Donahue's crew had come back to. The warm kitchen, the food that was ready, the fact that they'd stumbled out of a serious storm into a situation that had not expected them and had fed them anyway. 40 men, Silas said. The table didn't go immediately quiet. It took a second, and then the nearest men turned to look at him because Silas Boone talking was notable enough to pay attention to. What's that? Donahue said. I said 40 men. Silas was looking at Maeve, who was refilling the coffee at the far end of the table and had gone still without meaning to. Railroad camp up in the Wyoming Territory, 1871. This would have been 10 years back. Camp Cook died of fever in the middle of November. They were 50 miles from the nearest settlement and the snow had come in. 40 men, no cook, no way out. The room had gone quiet by now. The specific quiet that happens when someone older than everyone else in the room starts telling a story. Maeve set the coffee pot down. I was on that crew, Silas said. He was still looking at her. We thought we were done for. Not from the cold, wet. We had shelter, from the hunger. Without the cook, what we had was men who could boil water and not much else. 3 days in, morale was bad enough that the foreman was talking about breaking camp and trying to push out through the snow on foot, which would have killed half of us. The table was completely silent now. Then a woman showed up in the kitchen, Silas said. Big woman. Farmer's wife from the next valley over came in on horseback through 4 feet of snow because her husband was on our crew and she figured he was in trouble. She walked into that kitchen and she took over. 40 men, no proper supplies, a stove that was half broke. She fed us for 11 days until the relief wagon got through. Kept every single one of us on our feet. He paused. The room waited. I've been sitting here 2 days trying to figure out where I knew you from, he said to Maeve. It took me until this morning. That was you. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The kind of silence that happens when the ground shifts under a room. Maeve stood at the end of the table with her hands on the back of an empty chair. She looked at Silas Boone, and she looked at his face, and she thought back through 10 years of camps and kitchens and men she had fed and moved on from, and somewhere in the catalog of it, there was a night in Wyoming in the winter of 1871, a broke-down stove and a camp full of frightened men. And yes, I remember, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. You were younger, Silas said. But you walked into that kitchen the same way you walked into this one. He looked around the table. Like the situation was already handled, it just hadn't caught up with her yet. Something moved in the room then. She felt it before she could name it, the shift in the collective temperature that happens when people revise themselves. She'd felt it before, in the first supper she'd cooked here, but that had been small and tentative. This was different. This was the testimony of a man who had no reason to embellish and every reason to remember clearly, delivered in a room full of men who had just spent 2 days eating what she'd produced under conditions that hadn't been easy. Pete Dugan was the first one to make a sound. It was a long, slow exhale, more thought than breath. 40 men, he said. He wasn't saying it to anyone. He was just saying it. 11 days, Silas confirmed. Walt Briggs set his coffee cup down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he's thinking hard. He looked at the table, then at Maeve, then at his cup. I owe you an apology, he said. This was directed at Maeve. She looked at him. You don't... I said something to Dale Ridgway, Walt said. The second day you were here, about whether you were suited. He said the last word with the careful delivery of someone who knows that word is insufficient and is using it anyway because the honest version is worse. I said it out loud. You might not have heard. I heard, Maeve said. Walt winced, just slightly. I was wrong. The room was still quiet. Quiet in a way that big rooms full of men rarely were. She looked at all of them, at Pete and Walt, and the drive crew hands she'd been feeding for 2 days without knowing their names, at Donahue, who was holding his coffee cup and looking at the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read, And then she looked at Mercer. He was at the far end of the room, standing rather than sitting, which was how he ate most mornings. He had his arms at his sides, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It wasn't warm, exactly. Mercer didn't have warm in his range of expression, or if he did, he'd never directed any toward her. But it was something open, something that had let go of whatever had been held tight in it. "Mrs. Callister," he said. She waited. "I owe you more than that," he said. He wasn't looking at the table or at the wall. He was looking directly at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided that if he was going to say a hard thing, he was going to say it properly. "I made judgments about what you could do based on how you look. I said things I shouldn't have said, to the men and to Mr. Harrow both. I was incorrect." He paused. "And I was unkind. I'm sorry for both of those." The room was so quiet she could hear the stove tick. She'd rehearsed this moment, in the abstract. Not this specific version, but some version of the vindication she'd been working toward since the first morning. She'd imagined feeling satisfied, or righteous, or some clean, delivered version of what people described as having been proven right. What she actually felt was tired. Tired and something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. A loosening, somewhere deep, of something that had been held very tightly for a long time. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I appreciate that. I mean it." He nodded. Once. He wasn't a man who expanded on things once they were said. She picked up the coffee pot. "Breakfast is going cold," she said. "Eat while it's hot." The room came back to life then, gradually, the way a room does after a moment that everyone knows was important, but nobody quite knows how to follow. Conversations restarted. Cups were refilled. Donahue's men began the practical discussion of how soon the snow would pack enough to move cattle again, and Mercer sat down, which he almost never did at the communal table, and accepted the plate that Pete passed him without comment. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove with her back to the dining room. Her hands had started shaking. Not badly. Just the faint, fine tremor that came with the release of something held too long at tension. She pressed them flat on the stove's warming shelf and breathed until it passed. She heard boots behind her and turned. Gideon was in the kitchen doorway. He'd been there for the end of it. She'd seen him at the edge of the room, just inside the door, somewhere during Silas's accounting. She didn't know how much he'd heard. His face told her he'd heard enough. He looked at her for a moment. "Wyoming Territory," he said. 1871. "I was 22, she said. "My husband was on that crew. That's why I rode in." "How did you manage it? 40 men, a broken stove?" "Same way I manage anything." She turned back to the stove. "One meal at a time." He was quiet. She could hear him standing there, the slight sound of his breathing. "Mercer's never apologized to anyone in the 20 years I've known him," he said. "He should have done it sooner, but he did it. That's what counts." Another pause. "I should have—" he started, and then stopped. "You hired me," she said. "You approved the supply list. You told me I was staying." She kept her back to him. "You did what mattered." She heard him exhale. "The drive crew will need to move out tomorrow, if the snow holds off," he said, shifting register to practical, which was where he was most comfortable. "That brings us back to 14. "I know, I'll adjust the quantities." "Maeve." She stopped. He didn't use her first name. In 6 weeks she could count on one hand the times he hadn't called her Mrs. Callister, and those had all been accidents. She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she'd never quite been able to decode, the one that sat somewhere between assessment and something else. Something she'd stopped letting herself try to name because she didn't have the emotional reserves for where that naming might lead. "Thank you," he said, "for the last 2 days. For all of it." She looked at him. "You're welcome," she said. He went back out to his ranch. She went back to her stove. The drive crew left on Sunday morning. She was up before them, which was saying something because Donahue had his men moving at 4:30, packing and saddling in the cold dark of the barn. She'd made coffee and a double batch of biscuits, and she wrapped the biscuits in cloth to hold the heat and sent them out with the crew when they mounted up. Because 16 men riding out into post-blizzard cold were going to want something warm in their saddlebags, and it cost her nothing but 2 hours of early morning work to provide it. Donahue stopped at the kitchen door on his way out. He was a big man. and he filled the doorway in a way that required the people on both sides to account for it. He looked at her with a directness that wasn't unfriendly. "What do I owe you?" he said. "For the crew." "Nothing," she said. "That's Red Mesa's hospitality. Talk to Mr. Harrow." "I'll talk to Harrow." He paused. "But I'm asking you." She handed him a wrapped biscuit parcel. "Safe travel," she said. He looked at the parcel, then at her. "If you ever need work," he said, "Donahue Outfit can find a place for a cook like you." "I have work," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and walked out into the cold blue of the pre-dawn. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched them go. 16 men on horses moving south through the white landscape, their breath and the horses' breath making clouds in the still cold air, growing smaller against the enormous pale sky. Silas Boone was the last one out. He stopped his horse near the kitchen door and looked down at her from the saddle with the particular economy of expression that was just how his face worked. "You still ride?" he said. "When I need to." "Good horse?" he said, looking toward the barn. "I don't have one. Came in on a supply wagon." He appeared to consider this for a moment. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of burlap and handed it down to her. She took it. It was heavy, dense, the shape of a jar. "Honey," he said, "from my sister's place in Colorado. I carry it for the coffee." He looked at her for a moment. "Wyoming was a long time ago," he said. "But I never forgot it. Didn't think I'd get the chance to say so." She looked down at the jar in her hands. When she looked back up, he was already moving, turning the horse to catch up with the rest of the crew, and she stood in the doorway with the honey and watched him ride away into the white morning. The ranch felt different after they'd gone. It was the same ranch, the same Red Rock Mesa behind it, the same corral, the same bunkhouse she'd been cleaning and feeding out of for 6 weeks. But the 2 days of the storm and everything that had happened inside it had changed the quality of the space in a way she could feel but couldn't precisely name, as if the rooms had been rearranged without moving any furniture. The house crew came to breakfast at their usual time, and they were quieter than usual, which she'd expected. Men processed things slowly and in their own sequence, and what Silas had said at that table would work its way through all of them at different speeds. She didn't push on it. She made the breakfast and let it be. Walt Briggs helped her carry the water in from the pump without being asked. He didn't explain why. She didn't comment on it. Pete Dugan swept his bunkhouse kitchen floor after breakfast, also without being asked, with a borrowed broom and more thoroughness than the floor had probably received in months. When he was done, he leaned the broom against the wall and looked at his work. "I always thought cooking was sort of women's work," he said. Not defensively, more like a man reading from a list of things he believed and finding one that didn't hold up to examination. She was scrubbing the pot from the morning oatmeal. "Is it hard work?" she said. He thought about it. "Yeah." "Then it's work," she said. He thought about that too, then picked up the broom to put it back where it belonged. Mercer came to the kitchen at mid-morning. She was making the bread for the afternoon. The rhythm of it had become automatic, the mixing and the kneading, the building of the dough's structure under her hands, and she heard him come in and didn't turn around. "I meant what I said this morning," he said. "I know you did. I want you to know—" He stopped, started again. "I was the same way with Harrow's wife. When he brought her out here first year, I thought she wouldn't last the winter. She lasted 11 years. He paused. "She was the one who built the cold pantry, the vent in the floor." Maeve turned slightly. "I wondered about that. It's a smart design. She was a smart woman." He said it without sentiment, just as a fact. "I told him she'd leave. She proved me wrong. I should have learned from it." She turned back to the bread. "Some lessons take time," she said. "You learned it." She could hear him breathing behind her, the slight sound of a man who has said the thing he came to say and is now uncertain about what comes next. "The crew's going to need a day of rest before the work starts back up," he said, shifting into the familiar territory of the practical. "That blizzard ran them hard." "I know. I'll do something hot for mid-afternoon. Keeps the mood up." "Apple cake," he said. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes with a completely straight face. "From 2 nights ago," he said. "I saw the recipe she left in the kitchen drawer, Harrow's wife. She used to make it after hard days. Maeve thought about the recipe she'd found in the small wooden drawer of the prep table. A handwritten card in careful, rounded script, the ink old and slightly faded. "I'll make the apple cake," she said. He nodded. Just once. And then he went back out to his ranch work, and she went back to the bread. And somewhere in the mechanics of kneading and turning, she thought about a woman she'd never met, who had designed a cold pantry and left a recipe in a kitchen drawer. Small acts of forethought that were still doing their work years after she was gone. That was something, Maeve thought. That was really something. The afternoon was clear and cold and still, the kind of day that followed hard weather like a held breath. She had the apple cake in the oven by 2 o'clock, the cinnamon smell of it moving through the main house kitchen where she'd made it, using the woman's own oven, the recipe written in her hand, and spreading, she imagined, out through the covered walkway and into the bunkhouse, where she heard the subtle shift in conversation that meant men had caught a smell they recognized as good. She was cutting it into squares when she heard the back door of the main house open, and she looked up to find Elsie standing in the doorway in her coat with red cheeks and snow on her boots. "Walt says, 'Can I have a piece?'" Elsie said. "And also he wants to know if he can have a piece. He asked me to ask because he thought I had a better chance." Maeve looked at her daughter. "He's right," she said. "You do." She cut 2 extra squares and wrapped them in cloth and sent Elsie back out with them. Then she cut one for herself, something she almost never did, helped herself before the men were served, and stood at the kitchen counter and ate it while it was still warm. It was good. The recipe was a good one. The woman who'd written it had known what she was doing. She looked out the kitchen window at the red mesa catching the late afternoon light, the snow on the rock face bright and clean, the sky above it beginning to take on the first pale edge of the evening color that came before the real cold settled in. This kitchen. This view. This recipe in someone else's handwriting. She stood there with the last of her cake and let herself feel, very quietly, what it meant that she was still here. December came in without ceremony. The snow from the blizzard melted in patches and refroze at night and melted again, leaving the ranch yard a patchwork of muddy ground and dirty white that was neither fully one thing nor the other, the way early winter always was before it committed to itself. The men went back to work with the particular purposefulness of a crew that had been still too long. Fence lines to check for storm damage, cattle to account for, the 100 practical tasks that a working ranch generated daily, regardless of season or weather, or anything else that had happened the week before. Maeve went back to work too. The rhythms of the kitchen reasserted themselves without drama. The early mornings, the fires, the meals in their sequence, the cleaning and the planning and the restocking. The things that had happened during the blizzard, Silas Boone's testimony, Mercer's apology, the particular quality of those 2 storm-bound days, receded into the background the way significant things always did once life resumed its forward motion. They didn't disappear. They just found their proper place in the larger shape of things, no longer the foreground, still present as a changed foundation beneath everything else. She noticed the change in small ways. Walt Briggs had taken to leaving firewood inside the kitchen door rather than just outside it, which saved her 3 trips through the cold every morning. Pete Dugan had started making the bunkhouse coffee himself on her late mornings. Not because anyone asked, but because he'd watched her do it enough times that he'd figured out the proportions. And he left a note on the counter the first time that said, "Made it a little strong." Sorry in handwriting that suggested a young man who had not written many notes. 2 of the other hands, brothers named Cal and Virgil Marsh, who had been among the original corral fence crew she'd pegged as hostile in her first days, had developed the habit of clearing the table after supper without commentary, stacking the plates at the kitchen pass-through with a scraping efficiency that shortened her cleanup by 20 minutes every night. Nobody announced these changes. Nobody made a point of them. They just happened, the way the practical adjustments of people living in close quarters happened, the accumulation of small courtesies that no single person would call meaningful, but that, in aggregate, constituted something real. Mercer remained Mercer. He wasn't warm. She didn't expect him to become warm, and wouldn't have trusted it if he had. But the particular watchfulness was gone. He had a different quality now when he looked at her, something more neutral and less calculating. The way a man looked at a piece of equipment he'd stopped second-guessing and simply used. It was not a flattering comparison, but it was honest, and she preferred honest to falsely warm every time. It was Gideon who was different in a way she couldn't fully catalog. He'd always come to the kitchen in the mornings. That had been true since nearly the first week. But there was something different in how he came now, something that had lost the deliberate neutrality of those early days when they were both maintaining careful distances from whatever the other one was. He came in and poured his coffee, and sometimes he talked and sometimes he didn't, and the silence when it happened was the comfortable kind rather than the managed kind, which was a significant distinction. He started staying longer, not obviously, not in a way that would have announced itself, but she'd begun to notice that the 10-minute coffee had become 20, and then sometimes 30, the two of them in the main house kitchen while the ranch woke up outside and the light came in from the east-facing window. He would lean against the counter and she would work, and they would talk about the practical things, supply runs, the cattle count, the fence line report, and then sometimes beyond the practical, the way two people did when they had run out of necessary conversation and continued anyway. She told him about this hotel kitchen in Dillard's Crossing. He asked questions she didn't expect, specific questions about the volume and the mechanics of it, and she found herself talking about it with more detail than she'd told anyone in years. The particular challenge of 40 covers when the supplier was unreliable. The cook she'd worked with for 2 years who had been the best bread baker she'd ever known, and also completely impossible as a human being. He'd throw things, she said. When the timing went wrong, he'd just pick up whatever was nearest and throw it. Spoons, mostly. Once a full pot of something, which cleared the kitchen so fast it was almost impressive. Gideon looked at her with that quality of being almost amused. What did you do? Kept working. Throwing things requires someone to react to the throwing. I didn't react. He had no audience. He got bored of it. That's one approach. It works on most bad behavior, she said. And he looked at her, and she looked back, and they both understood that she wasn't only talking about the baker. Elsie had become, by December, a fixture of the ranch in a way that Maeve had been watching with the complicated feelings of a mother who wanted her daughter to feel at home, and was also aware, always, that home could be taken away. The crew had folded her in with the comfortable ease of men who had decided, collectively, that she belonged there, which was the most complete form of acceptance the outfit could offer. Pete had taught her to braid rope. Walt had continued the cloud-naming project through all weather conditions, which meant they could often be found standing in the cold yard pointing at the sky with the focused disagreement of genuine experts. Even the Marsh brothers, Cal and Virgil, who were not generally men of many words, had developed a running exchange with her about the relative merits of the various ranch horses, which Elsie engaged in with the passion of someone who had recently acquired strong opinions. Gideon watched this. She knew he watched it because she watched him watching, in the peripheral way she'd developed for keeping track of the room while appearing to focus entirely on the work in front of her. One afternoon in the second week of December, she was in the garden behind the barn. The winter squash had come in, a fact she found disproportionately satisfying given how late in the season she'd planted it. And she was harvesting what the frost hadn't taken, which was more than she'd expected, when she heard Elsie's voice from the other side of the barn fence. "Mr. Harrow, do horses get cold?" A pause. Then Gideon's voice, which was not generally a voice that addressed 6-year-olds on any regular basis. "They do. Do they mind it?" "Depends on the horse. Duchess minds it." This was said with absolute authority. She stands with her back to the wind, and she does this thing with her ears. I've seen that. Walt says it means she's unhappy. Pete says it means she's cold, and that's different from unhappy. I think Pete's wrong. Another pause. Why? Because if you're cold for a long time, you get unhappy. That's just what happens. Maeve stayed very still in the garden. That's a fair point, Gideon said. She heard Elsie apparently accept this and move on to something else, the conversation shifting to what Duchess had eaten that morning and whether it was enough. And she went back to her harvesting with her hands in the cold dirt and a feeling in her chest that she still hadn't fully decided what to call. The squash was heavier than it looked. She carried it back to the kitchen in 2 trips, which was one more trip than she liked admitting was necessary. The supply wagon came the 3rd Friday of December, and with it, a letter. Cobb the freight hauler handed it to her when she came out to help unload. He'd developed a cautious friendliness toward her over the months, the kind that freight haulers develop toward people who reliably offered coffee and didn't make their stops difficult. The letter had her name on it in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her sister Margaret, in Omaha. She put it in her apron pocket and finished helping with the unloading, and she read it that evening after Elsie was asleep. Margaret was 3 years younger and had made a different set of decisions. A house in Omaha, a husband who worked the railroad office, 2 children who were apparently doing well in school. They wrote when they could, which wasn't often, because both of them were busy, and because the distance between Omaha and Red Mesa was the kind of distance that made letters feel like small ships crossing uncertain water. Margaret's letter was warm and worried in equal measure, the combination her sister had always managed. Are you well? Are you being fed properly? Is the man decent? What happens when winter truly sets in? Do you need us to send anything? Elsie must be so big now. Please write back when you can. Maeve sat at the small table in her room with the lamp turned up and read the letter twice. She thought about what she'd write back. She'd write that she was well. That was true. That the man was decent. She'd have to think about exactly how to say that, because decent was a thin word for whatever Gideon Harrow was, and she wasn't ready to use better words in a letter that Margaret would read and then discuss with her husband in a way that carried implications Maeve wasn't ready to examine. She'd write that Elsie was thriving, which was absolutely true, and which she could say with the full warmth she felt about it. She would not write about the mornings in the kitchen. She would not write about the conversation she'd had 3 days ago about apple trees Gideon had mentioned, with the careful casualness of a man mentioning something he'd been thinking about, that the spot behind the main house where she'd first tried the garden had enough southern exposure for apple trees, and that there was a nursery in Dillard's Crossing that did mail order on rootstock. And had she ever grown apples? She'd said she hadn't. He'd said he'd been thinking about it for a while. Then he'd gone to see about the fence line report, and she'd stood at the kitchen window thinking about apple trees for longer than was warranted. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She would write to Margaret on Sunday, when she had a clear hour. She would write the things that were easy to say, and leave the rest in the category of things she was still working out. The hard cold came in the 4th week of December. The real winter, the kind that made the blizzard feel like a rehearsal. The temperature dropped and stayed down, and the mornings had a quality of cold that required a full 10 minutes by the stove before her hands worked properly. She'd adjusted the kitchen routines accordingly, double the morning fire, banking it differently the night before to hold more heat into the early hours, keeping a pot of water on the warming shelf overnight so she had hot water for the coffee without having to wait for it to come up from cold. Small adjustments. The kind that came from knowing the kitchen's particular personality, its quirks and tendencies, the way any long acquaintance taught you the specific character of a thing. It was during that hard, cold week that the incident with the supply line happened. She'd noticed the flour was running low 3 days before the scheduled Friday delivery. She mentioned it to Gideon on the Wednesday morning, and he said he'd sent word to Dillard's to confirm the delivery was on schedule. On Thursday afternoon, Pete came back from the east fence with news that the supply road over Cutter's Creek was iced over. A section of it had flooded in the blizzard runoff and frozen solid, and Cobb's wagon couldn't get through it without risking the team. No delivery Friday. Maeve stood in the dry pantry and took stock. Flour, enough for 2 more days at full use, 3 if she stretched it. Cornmeal. Better, a week at least. Dried beans, solid. Salt pork was the real worry. She was down to what she'd put by specifically against emergency, the reserve she'd built up over the past month precisely because she'd learned that in this country, supply lines were suggestions. She did the math. She could feed 14 men adequately for 5 days without the delivery. She could do it for a week if she was willing to get creative, which she was. What she couldn't do was maintain the usual standard. The bread twice a day, the full stew, the biscuits that had become the background expectation of the crew's mornings. She went to find Gideon. He was in the barn with Mercer, going over the condition of the cattle that had been in the winter paddock. She waited at the barn door rather than interrupting. She'd learned his rhythms well enough to know when he was in a conversation that needed to finish before she could have her own. And when he looked up and saw her standing there, he said something to Mercer and came over. "Supply road's out," she said. "I know. Pete told me. I've got enough for 5 days at full rate. 7 if I adjust." She looked at him directly. "I can keep everyone fed, but the menu changes." He held her gaze. "What does that mean?" "It means less bread. More cornmeal porridge in the mornings, which isn't what they're used to, but it'll hold them. Beans forward instead of as a side. Soup stretched thinner than I'd normally run them. She paused. The men will notice. The men will live with it, he said. I know they'll live with it. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when Mercer asks. Something crossed his face, something that was, she thought, very close to amusement. You predict Mercer's complaints in advance now? I predict everyone's complaints in advance, she said. It's the most useful skill I have. He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the undecodable one, the one she'd stopped letting herself try to name. And then he said, I'll get a man out to Cutter's Creek today to see if there's a way to chip the ice. Might be we can get a partial delivery through by Sunday. That would help. Sunday's not guaranteed. Sunday's better than not at all. He nodded, and she turned to go back to the kitchen, and he said, Maeve. She stopped. The crew knows what this ranch looked like before you came, he said. They'll manage for a few days. She turned to look at him. Before I came, she said, what did the kitchen look like? He considered. Like a place where food happened sometimes. And now? He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when he was choosing words more carefully than his usual economy required. Like somewhere people want to be, he said. She looked at him for a beat longer than the conversation required. Sunday then, she said. I'll count on the ice crew. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and allowed herself 30 seconds of something she couldn't name before she turned back to the work. He sent 3 men to Cutter's Creek on Friday, and they worked through the afternoon with picks and shovels and managed to clear enough of the ice that Cobb got his wagon through late on Saturday afternoon with a reduced load. 2 sacks of flour, more salt pork than she'd hoped for, a sack of oats, coffee. Not everything she needed, but enough to change the calculation significantly. She made biscuits for Sunday breakfast, which was 1 day later than usual, and when she set them on the table, Pete Dugan said, I knew you'd figure something out, with the absolute confidence of a young man who has decided that a certain person does not run out of solutions. She didn't correct him. She thought it was probably better for everyone if he remained confident on that point, at least for now. It was 3 days before Christmas when Gideon came to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long moment before saying anything. She was making pie. The larder was back in good order, the flour and lard sufficient, and she'd had a mind to make something better than strictly necessary for the season because the crew had earned it and because she felt like making pie, which was its own sufficient reason. She'd rolled the crust and was fitting it to the pan when he came in, and she didn't look up because the crust was at a delicate stage that didn't tolerate inattention. I need to talk to you about something, he said. Talk. She worked the crust to the edge of the pan. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man arranging something. The ranch has a Christmas tradition, he said. Had. When? Before. There was a dinner, Christmas Eve, the whole crew, the main house, everything laid out properly. He paused. We stopped doing it after Eleanor died. 3 years ago. Mercer suggested bringing it back this year. She looked up now. Mercer suggested it. Last week. Said the men had been talking about it. She thought about Mercer, who had apologized in front of 30 men and left a recipe on her counter as an offering, who was apparently now advocating for Christmas dinners. People contained more than they initially showed. She'd known this her whole life and was still, sometimes, surprised by it. What would it involve, she said. Whatever you think it should involve. He met her eyes. I'm asking if you're willing, not telling you it's required. She looked at him. There's a difference? There is, he said. And the way he said it was careful and deliberate, the way he sometimes spoke when he was saying more than the surface words. She turned back to the pie crust, pressed the edge with her thumb, the way her mother had taught her, the small, crimped pattern that took a minute and made the thing look finished. What did Eleanor make? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Roast beef if we had it, potatoes, something sweet. She made a chocolate cake one year that the men still talk about, candles on the table. He paused. She put pine branches down the center, from the scrub pines up the north ridge. Did she make it by herself? No. The men helped. Even Mercer. She had everyone in the kitchen at some point. Something in his voice when he talked about her. Not raw grief, not after 3 years, but something that had been lived with long enough to sit quietly inside a sentence without breaking it open. I'll make the dinner, Maeve said. Tell Mercer to send someone for the pine branches. He was still for a moment. Thank you, he said. "I'll need twice the flour allocation and whatever you have for a beef roast." "Done." He pushed off the counter and went to the door, and she was about to ask him about the roast specifications when he stopped in the doorway, not turning around, his back to her. "She would have liked you," he said, quietly. Not performed, just said, the way a fact got said. She stood at the counter with her hands on the pie pan and didn't say anything because the moment didn't call for speech, and she was practical enough to know when silence was the better answer. She heard him walk out through the main house toward the front door, and she stood there for a moment in the kitchen that had been Eleanor Harrow's kitchen, with Eleanor Harrow's recipe in the drawer and Eleanor Harrow's cold pantry under the floor, and the woman's careful handwriting somewhere in the back of her memory. Then she put the pie in the oven, because it needed its time, and she started planning the Christmas dinner. She needed pine branches. She knew where the North Ridge was. She'd figure out the candles. The beef roast she could handle in her sleep. The Christmas dinner took 2 days to prepare. Not because the cooking itself required 2 days. She'd produced more complex meals in shorter windows. But because a dinner like this one was not only about the food, it was about the arrangement of a space, the deliberate construction of an atmosphere that said to the people inside it, "You are worth this effort." That took time. That took care. She sent Cal Marsh up to the North Ridge on the morning of the 23rd with instructions about which pine branches held their needles best in warm air and how many she'd need for the table length. He came back with more than she asked for, which she took as its own kind of communication. She trimmed them herself that afternoon, fitting them down the center of the long dining table in the main house, the table that had been under a cloth since she'd arrived, and that she'd uncovered that morning to find solid oak beneath, well made, the kind of table built to last. She found candles in the supply shed, half a box of white tapers that had been there long enough to have a faint coating of dust, which she wiped clean. She set them in holders she improvised from the tin cups she found at the back of the kitchen shelf, the ones nobody used, filling the bottoms with dried beans to hold the tapers upright. Not elegant, but real. And real was what she was after. The beef roast went in Christmas Eve morning, a proper cut that Gideon had sourced from the winter stores, better than she'd expected. She rubbed it with salt and cracked pepper and dried rosemary from the bundle she kept hanging by the kitchen window, seared it in lard until the outside took color, and transferred it to the oven with halved onions and the last of the root vegetables from the cold pantry. The potatoes she prepared separately, roasted in the beef drippings, which was the correct way, and the only way, as far as she was concerned. She'd debated the chocolate cake. She had the cocoa. She'd ordered it specifically 2 supply runs back without letting herself fully examine why. And she had the eggs and the sugar and the technique. What she hadn't had, until she stood in the kitchen on the morning of December 24th, was the certainty that making Eleanor Harrow's signature Christmas dessert was the right thing to do. She made it anyway, not because she was trying to replicate what had come before, not to fill Eleanor's place or occupy her kitchen in some symbolic sense. She made it because the recipe was a good one and the men deserved something extraordinary, and because, she admitted this to herself while she creamed the butter and sugar together, she was making a home here, whether she'd fully decided that yet or not. And homes were built partly from the things that came before you and partly from what you chose to carry forward. The cake came out of the oven at 4 in the afternoon, and the smell of it moved through the main house and out the front door and apparently reached the barn, because Pete Dugan appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later with his hat in his hands and an expression of transparent hope. "Not until tonight," she said without looking up. "I wasn't going to—" "You were." He left. The crew came to the main house table at 6 o'clock. All 14 of them, Gideon's house crew plus Mercer, dressed in whatever they had that was clean, which varied considerably in quality but was uniform in effort. Pete had water-slicked his hair flat in a way that made him look both younger and more serious. Walt had produced, from some depth of his belongings, a bolo tie with a silver clasp that he wore with the gravity of formal occasion. Even the Marsh brothers, Cal and Virgil, who were not men who thought much about appearance, had apparently come to some agreement about the situation, because both of them had clean shirts on and Cal had shaved recently enough that it showed. Mercer came in last and sat at his usual end of the table and looked at the pine branches and the candlelight and said nothing. But she saw something move in his face, quickly and then gone, that she filed away without comment. Gideon sat at the head of the table. Elsie sat beside him, which had happened by some organic negotiation that Maeve had not organized and did not fully understand, except that Elsie had apparently decided this was her seat for the evening and no one had disagreed. Maeve brought the food out herself. She'd refused help with the serving, not because she needed to prove something, but because this particular meal needed to arrive in a particular way, whole and unhurried, and she knew how to do that better than anyone she could have delegated it to. The beef roast, rested and sliced. The potatoes, browned and fragrant. A pot of gravy she'd built from the pan drippings, dark and savory. Bread, because there was always bread. And at the end, the chocolate cake on the board she used for serving, the frosting she'd made from sugar and cocoa and a careful measure of cream. The table was quiet when she brought it out. Not the silence of indifference. The silence of people taking in something they hadn't expected to feel. "Well," Walt said. That was all he said, but he said it in a tone that contained a great deal. The meal was loud in the way good Christmas dinners were loud, not in volume, but in density. The table full of conversation and the sound of men eating well and the occasional burst of laughter at something one of the Marsh brothers said, which was notable because the Marsh brothers almost never generated laughter and seemed mildly startled by their own success. Elsie talked to Gideon about Duchess the horse and her ear-flattening cold-weather behavior with the focused intensity of a child pursuing a subject she cared about, and Gideon answered her with the patience of a man who had learned, over 3 months of breakfast-table proximity to a 6-year-old, that the most efficient path through these conversations was genuine engagement rather than deflection. Maeve ate her own meal at the table, which she didn't always do. Some evenings she ate standing in the kitchen between tasks, which was faster. But tonight she sat, at the opposite end from Gideon, and she ate the food she'd made and listened to the sounds of the room and let herself be in it rather than just running it. Her back hurt. Her hands were dry from the cold water and the day's work. She was, underneath the particular alertness that a big meal required, bone-tired in the way that had become her standard state since November. She was also, she noticed, genuinely happy. Not the careful, provisional kind of happy she'd been allowing herself in small measures. Something less managed than that. It was Mercer who stood first, after the cake had been served and eaten, and most of the men were pushing back from the table with the expressions of people who have eaten past the point of necessity and do not regret it. He stood and looked down the table, and the room quieted the way it did when Mercer had something to say. "This ranch had a Christmas dinner for 12 years, he said, "and then it didn't for 3. He paused. He was not a man who made speeches, and he was clearly aware that he was making one, and the discomfort of that was visible. He pushed through it. The last 3 years were quiet, in a way that wasn't good. He looked at Maeve. "You put the fire back in this place. I mean, the kitchen fire, but also the other kind." He stopped, apparently having arrived at the limit of what he could say without embarrassing himself, and he raised his coffee cup. "To Red Mesa Ranch." The table raised their cups. "Red Mesa Ranch," they said, in the overlapping way of men who hadn't rehearsed it. Elsie, not to be left out, raised her milk cup with the solemnity of someone participating in a ritual she fully understood. Maeve looked at her daughter. She looked at the pine branches down the center of the table and the candles in their improvised tin holders and the men she'd been feeding for 3 months, who had become, she could say this now, she could let herself say this, her people, in the way that the people you fed and worked alongside and got through hard things with became your people. She raised her cup. The spring came the way it always did on the mesa. Not gently, not as a gradual warming, but in arguments with the cold, warm days followed by freezing nights. The ground alternately soft and iron, the light extending in noticeable increments that everyone on the ranch tracked the way people tracked things they'd been waiting for. She ordered the apple tree rootstock from Dillard's in February, and Gideon helped her plant them behind the main house in March, the two of them on their knees in the cold mud pressing the bare roots into the ground she'd worked through the autumn. It was dirty, physical work, and they did it without much conversation, which was how they did most things now, in a comfortable parallel that had grown up between them over the months like something planted and quietly tended. Heck Donahue came through in late March with his drive crew heading north, and he stopped at the ranch for a night, as he'd done in the old days before the 3 quiet winters. He ate supper at the main house table, and he told Gideon that Red Mesa Ranch's reputation had traveled. that his outfit and two others talked about it as the best overnight stop on the Northern Trail, which was partly the hospitality and partly, he said with directness, the cook. I'll raise the offer from last fall, he said to Maeve after supper, sitting at the kitchen table while she cleaned up. He said it plainly, no maneuvering, the way he did things. Good money. I'm building a permanent camp operation, not just a drive outfit. I need someone who can run a real kitchen. She'd known something like this was coming. She'd known it the way she knew weather, from the quality of the air, from small signs that accumulated into a pattern. She'd been preparing her answer for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She set the pot down. What's the number? She said, because she wasn't going to turn down a serious offer without knowing what it was. He told her. It was significantly more than what Red Mesa Ranch paid her. It was honestly more than she'd earned in any previous position. She looked at the pot in her hands, at the kitchen around her, the stove she knew by temperature and mood, the window that faced east, the cold pantry with its floor vent, the drawer with the recipe card in careful, rounded handwriting. No, she said. Donahue looked at her. He wasn't a man who asked twice as a rule, but something in his expression indicated he was considering it. It's a fair offer, he said. It is, she said, and I'm turning it down. He studied her for a moment with the assessing eyes of a man who had dealt in livestock and labor for 30 years and could usually read a situation. Harrow, he said, not a question. She looked at him. This place, she said. Not just Harrow, this place. Donahue looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man seeing something he hadn't looked at closely before. At the herbs hanging by the window, at the neatly ordered shelves, at the small slate on the corner shelf where Elsie had drawn a picture of a horse with distinctly expressive ears that had been there for 2 months, and that nobody had moved. All right, he said. He stood, pushed his chair in, a small courtesy she'd noticed about him always, and picked up his hat. If you change your mind, the offer stands to fall. I won't change my mind. He went to find Gideon, and she went back to the cleaning, and she stood at the sink and looked out the window at the dark yard and felt the decision settle into her bones, the way right decisions settled. Not with fanfare, just with the quiet recognition of a thing clicking into its proper place. She didn't tell Gideon about the offer that night. She told him the next morning because he deserved to know and because she believed in saying plainly what needed saying. She told him while he was at the counter with his coffee, before the ranch was fully awake, in the particular private quality of those early morning hours that had become theirs over the months without being formally designated as such. He was quiet when she finished, looking at his cup. You turned it down, he said. I did. Why did you tell me? Because it affects you and because I don't like keeping things from people She stopped, adjusted. People I work for. He looked up from his cup. She kept her eyes on the stove. The silence stretched. She could hear the barn sounds starting up, the horses, the morning activity of the crew beginning to move, and the kitchen fire settling in the stove. Maeve, he said. I know, she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. Not to cut him off. She just found, in that moment, that she needed to say something first. I know what you're going to say, and I know it isn't straightforward, and I know I came here as your employee, and that makes the whole thing. Would you stop working for a moment, he said. She stopped. I'm not. He set his cup down on the counter with a small, definitive sound. I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 2 months. Every time I get close, there's a meal to get out, or a supply issue, or Mercer needs something, and I keep telling myself there's a better time, but there is no better time. There's just this. He looked at her directly, with the full, unguarded quality that he almost never allowed in his expression. I don't want you to stay as my cook. I want you to stay because this is your home. I want it to be your home. He stopped, rearranged, tried again. I want to give you and Elsie a permanent place here. Not because I need a cook. Because Another pause. A man working at the edge of his vocabulary for something. Because the ranch is better with you in it. I am better with you in it. And I'd like to stop pretending that's a professional observation. She looked at him. He looked back, with the expression of a man who has said the thing and is now waiting for the ground to show him what it's made of. She'd been carrying the weight of this for months, the careful not naming of it, the practical distance she'd maintained for practical reasons, The constant return to the work is the thing that made everything else manageable. She'd thought she was protecting herself. She'd thought she was being sensible. Standing here now, with the winter light coming through the east window and the coffee going cold on the counter, and this man looking at her without any of his usual careful management of expression, she understood that what she'd actually been doing was waiting. Not for conditions to be perfect, because she was 42 years into this life and knew better than to wait for perfect. Waiting for the thing itself to prove it was real. 3 months of cold mornings and honest conversation, and a man who asked questions and listened to the answers and sent 3 men to chip ice off a supply road and said she would have liked you to her back in a kitchen doorway. That was what real looked like. She recognized it. "Gideon," she said. He waited. "Ask me plainly," she said. "Not the long way. Ask me plainly." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was, not from uncertainty, but from the particular weight of the moment, the way a person stood at the edge of something large and let themselves feel the size of it before stepping. "Yes," she said. Not decorated, not performed, just the word, said clearly, in a kitchen that had become her kitchen in every way that mattered. He crossed the room in 2 steps, and she turned fully to face him, and he took her face in both hands the way a man held something he was afraid of dropping, and he looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, as though he wanted to make sure she was real. She was real. They were married before the spring roundup, on a Wednesday afternoon in April, with Mercer and Walt as witnesses, and Elsie in the dress Maeve had kept in the trunk for circumstances she hoped wouldn't arise. It was, she'd decided, exactly the circumstance the dress had been waiting for. The justice of the peace came out from Dillard's Crossing, a small man named Fitch who had performed enough frontier weddings to have developed an efficient brevity about the whole affair that Maeve genuinely appreciated. He said the words, they said theirs, Fitch recorded it in his book, and it was done. Pete Duggan cried, which he denied immediately, and which everyone agreed not to mention again. The crew had organized a supper in the main house without telling her, or rather, they'd told Gideon, and he'd kept it from her, which she found both irritating and entirely characteristic of him. She walked into the main house after the ceremony to find the table set with the pine branch centerpiece that had been packed away after Christmas and brought back out for this, the candles in their tin holders, the food that her crew had cooked themselves with varying degrees of competence and considerable effort. Walt had made the biscuits. She could tell from across the room that they were dense and slightly irregular, the way biscuits were when made by someone who'd watched the technique but hadn't internalized the touch. She ate 3 of them and told him they were excellent, which was not entirely true, and the expression on his face was worth every bite. The spring roundup came 3 weeks after the wedding, and it was the largest Red Mesa had run in years. The outfit swelled to 28 hands at peak, the kitchen running at full capacity from before dawn until well past dark. Maeve at the center of it with the efficient calm that had become her particular reputation in this part of the territory. Donahue's crew passing through on the northern drive told men at other ranches that Red Mesa's cook was the best on the frontier. Those men told other men. By summer, there were riders stopping at the ranch who had ridden 20 miles out of their way on the strength of the recommendation. She didn't let it change how she cooked. The work was the work. You fed the people in front of you as well as you possibly could, and you did it again and again. And in the doing of it, you built the thing you were actually building, which was never only a meal. Elsie started a garden of her own that summer, a small plot beside Maeve's, which was now producing the first leggy growth of the apple trees and a respectable showing of the vegetables she'd been refining all year. Elsie planted sunflowers along the fence. Her own idea, she said, when Maeve found her pushing seeds into the ground with her thumb. Maeve stood very still for a moment. "Where did you hear about sunflowers?" she said. Elsie looked up. "Mr. Harrow mentioned it," she said. "He said they used to grow here. He said we should bring them back." She pressed another seed in with a child's focused seriousness. "He said the horses like having something to look at." Maeve looked at the fence line where the seeds now sat in the dark earth. She thought about the woman who had first planted them, who had built the cold pantry and left the recipe and made the chocolate cake that men still talked about years after she was gone. She thought about the particular way that lives left traces, in recipes, in well-built rooms, in the habits of kindness that outlasted the person who'd taught them. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere and be told, in ways large and small, that you were not what was wanted, and what it meant to stay anyway. To keep the fire and feed the people and work the ground and refuse, quietly but absolutely, to become less than you were because someone else's accounting was wrong. She had been the wrong woman by the measure of everyone who met her at that first door. Too heavy, too worn, too much of a complication. She'd heard the arithmetic of it so many times that she could have done it herself by now, could have calculated her own deficiency in the terms other people used. But the arithmetic that mattered was never the visible kind. It was what a person held when the storm came in and whether they stayed at the stove. It was what they built in the hours before dawn when no one was watching. It was the kind of care that showed up in a cold pantry floor vent and a recipe card and a garden that kept growing past the person who'd started it. Worth was not granted. It was demonstrated, repeatedly, in ordinary moments, in the doing of necessary things with full attention and without ceasing. She'd known that at 22 in a Wyoming railroad camp. She'd known it when she'd answered a stranger's advertisement in a battered newspaper and packed her daughter and her cast-iron skillet onto a supply wagon heading for the end of the world. She knew it now, standing in her own garden on her own land, listening to her daughter argue with the soil about the correct depth for sunflower seeds. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been easy. The back still ached in cold mornings, and the hands were still rough from the work, and the frontier still demanded things that the body produced at cost, and some days the cost was higher than others. The men were not always kind, and the weather was not always manageable, and there were mornings still when she stood at the kitchen stove in the dark before anyone was awake and felt the full weight of everything it had taken to arrive here. But she was here. She had made herself here, in the only way that mattered. Not by being invited, but by being necessary. And then by being known, and then by being home. She knelt beside Elsie in the garden. A little deeper, she said, taking her daughter's hand gently and pressing it further into the soil. They need room to take hold. Elsie nodded with great seriousness and adjusted her technique. That evening, after supper, after the crew had gone to the bunkhouse and Elsie was asleep and the kitchen was cleaned and banked for the night, Maeve sat on the main house porch with Gideon in the last of the April light. The mesa caught the sunset differently in spring, warmer, the red of the rock pulling the orange light down into it until the whole landscape seemed to be lit from inside. He had his coffee. She had hers. They sat in the particular comfortable silence of two people who had nothing urgent to say and no need to fill the quiet. After a while he said, "The apple trees are taking." "I know. I checked them this morning. Couple more years we might actually get fruit. Probably 3. Worth waiting for." She looked out at this mesa, at the sky going deeper colors above it, at the land that was, in its spare and uncompromising way, genuinely beautiful. Not the easy kind of beautiful that announced itself, but the kind that you earned access to by staying long enough to understand it. "Yes," she said, "it is." The kitchen fire was banked behind them, holding its heat for the morning. The sunflower seeds were in the ground. The apple trees were taking hold in the dark soil behind the barn, where a woman she'd never met had once grown things and left the ground ready. Tomorrow, there would be breakfast to make before dawn, and the work would be hard and long and imperfect and entirely worth doing. It always was.